Warm welcome to the National CSO meeting, the National Clinical Safety Officer meeting, and held jointly with the Faculty of Clinical Informatics Specialist Interest Group in Clinical Safety, or the SIG group, Specialist Interest Group. So just a few housekeeping points. If you could try and keep on mute. We are recording today, as I mentioned, and we also will be taking questions at the end of each presentation. So try not to interrupt as we go through the presentations. Maggie is going to coordinate some of the questions, but we'll take them either. She'll relate them, or we may call you in to ask a specific question, depending on the numbers of questions we get and the themes. But do put them in chat as we go along, as you think about them. I'm going to do some brief introductions. I'm Sebastian Alexander. I'm Strategic Clinical Lead for Patient Safety at NHS Digital, and also Founder Fellow of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics and a member of the SIG, Specialist Interest Group for Clinical Safety, and a long-term interest in clinical safety as well, and sit on the Clinical Safety Group. And if I could hand over to Maggie, just an introduction, Maggie, quickly.
Hi, I'm Maggie Lay. I'm also on the Clinical Safety Group, SIG, of the faculty. I'm a registered nurse and a clinical safety officer working for South Central West CSU, and I'm involved in that capacity in doing some of the DTAC that comes out of NHSX, and we're doing some high-level DTAC work ourselves.
And thank you, Maggie. And Clive.
Yes, like Maggie, I'm a clinical safety officer and support and participate in this SIG, and again, like Maggie, I support the DTAC process as an assessor, working with Maggie for South Central West.
Okay, thank you. And we've also got Jan as well. Jan, just say hello.
Hello, I'm the business manager at the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. Hi.
And also Ben, so say hi as well, Ben, so we know who you are.
Hello, I'm Ben. I'm the membership manager at the faculty.
Okay, so yeah, thanks to Ben for doing all the admitting and coordination, and thanks to Jan as well, of course. So today we're talking about the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria, or DTAC as it's called, and very pleased to introduce Lauren Harkins, who's kindly offered to speak on DTAC. Kelsey was going to be on the call as well, but she's unable to attend today. So Lauren's covering off a little bit of Kelsey's presentation as well. So we'll be talking about the DTAC and some of the detail around that. So I'll let Lauren introduce herself when she speaks. That's the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Then we're going to go on to hear from Damian Williams, who's a GP in Birmingham, and also a member of Birmingham and Solihull CCG, and really talking about the practical implementation and use of DTAC and how you can actually use it in practice. And he'll expand on content and introduce himself when he comes to speak as well. So that's a little bit about that day. We are finishing at 2:30 on the dot. We are trying to aim to now allow some time for questions. We always run out of time on these calls somehow, but we're going to make an effort to try and have some time for discussion. So try and think about questions, how it applies to your practice and how it applies to your kind of in the areas you particularly work in. So really warm welcome, and a big thanks to me to Damian and Lauren for pulling this together. A lot of work involved, but thank you so much. But I'm going to hand over. I hope I've covered everything off. Maggie or Clive always remind me. I always forget something. But I'm going to hand over to Lauren to introduce herself and to start and on the how do you do DTAC. So Lauren, over to you. I'm just going to share slides now.
Thank you so much, Sebastian and team. So I'm Lauren Harkins. I'm Assistant Director of Programmes in NHSX, and I will apologise in advance if I cough throughout this. Hopefully I've saved some voice through this morning, but I've had a slight cold, as has been going around. So I run 3 programmes in NHSX, the first being DTAC and evaluation. Second, our Digital Health Partnership Awards, so supporting programmes that really exemplify the best of partnership working, and also our mobile health apps and digital health programme. And I also currently part-time, head up stakeholder engagement for COVID Pass and vaccine certification. And as Sebastian said, I'm also going to present today, and I'll start with sort of a quick update and overview on our digital clinical safety strategy on behalf of Kelsey, who can't be here today. And that's been a great initiative working with colleagues across NHS England, NHS Digital, and various other partners to ensure that we get to a really good strategy that can be rolled out and embedded in the NHS. So if I could get the first slide, please. So this is a sort of a really quick introduction into what our vision really is in NHSX for digital health. So we really want to ensure that we become the safest health and care system in the world. And in order to do that, we've identified 5 key things that we think are necessary to make that happen. So firstly, it absolutely needs to be embedded within the culture of all NHS organisations, individually and collectively, as the NHS as a whole. The solutions we use need to help us improve patient safety, should be digitally enabled. Digital technologies applied to tackle major patient safety issues. The processes for how we mitigate risk need to be easy to follow, and also need to be really clear and easy to understand. We need to ensure that we've equipped people so that the training provision is right to really undertake digital safety actions. So I know that we've got some really experienced CSOs on the call today, and some who are relatively new. We know that, for example, people have said that the training, you can do this training, you can be a super qualified clinician, but actually then it can be quite daunting when you're first doing your first clinical safety cases. So it's really ensuring that the sort of initial training and ongoing support offering is there. And then the 5th pillar is making sure that decisions are really data driven and that we use data at the heart of what we do to drive decision making. Next slide, please. So we launched the first iteration of the digital clinical safety strategy in September. As I say, that built on a huge amount of work and brought in multiple stakeholders who were invaluable, enabling us to launch that. And it sets the national direction for digital clinical safety in the NHS and puts in place commitments to meet the vision that we've just described. Next slide, please. So if we really take a step back and think about why we need a digital clinical safety strategy, there are a few really important components. So we've seen an explosion of digital health technologies across the NHS over the past few years. What this means is it's highlighted that we absolutely need to increase the attention of the safety of these technologies as they become embedded in pathways and as more and more technologies are adopted at scale throughout the NHS. We've seen, I think this is now slightly out of date as of yesterday, so we've now got over 20 million NHS app registrations, up from 2 million earlier this year, largely down to certification, but that's now a huge captive audience through that NHS app, which can be a really powerful tool. When we think about patient safety in totality, so not just digital safety, we know that we can save lives and also save cost if we get that core safety element correct. Part of this is really about having the technology to enable improvements in patient care and to do that safely. And thirdly, along with the long-term plan and the patient safety strategy, there is this huge point and coming together in terms of digital safety strategy. If I can get the next slide, please. So there are really 2 key aims of the digital safety strategy. One is improving the safety of technologies used in health and social care. And 2, to use those technologies to really improve patient safety problems. They're 2 sides of the same coin, equally important in ensuring digital safety. And next slide, please. So the strategy that we've just launched is absolutely aligned to the National Patient Safety Strategy, and we've been careful to ensure that we're using the same building blocks, so that insight and involvement drive improvement, and eventually help achieve the safety systems and safety cultures that we're really looking to embed. Next slide, please. So this really depicts the engagement that the multidisciplinary teams did. So they ran really large-scale workshops, had some quite diverse engagement activities to ensure that the priorities of the strategy were embraced by those that would be involved and those that would be targeted. Then there was a large piece about using stakeholder engagement feedback to really ensure that the themes that were generated for the strategy were aligned to that. There were a number of key stakeholders who were involved as the strategy continued to be drafted and iterated, really thinking about the editing and the language, and also ensuring that that patient voice was engaged there. And now the team are in the implementation phase, and it's really important that we continue to engage with stakeholders to ensure that people support and buy into the actions that the strategy will deliver. And next slide, please. So the strategy makes 5 national commitments. These are underpinned by 23 concrete actions. However, currently, as of today, we're focusing on the 5 current commitments. So collecting information about the digital clinical safety, sorry, including the LFPSE events, and ensuring that it supports system-wide learning. Involvement, so really ensuring that we have a centralized source of digital clinical safety information, best practice blueprints, training materials, and expanding that training access across the health and care system. The third one being improvement, and so really accelerating the adoption of digital technologies to record and then track implanted medical devices through the Medical Device Safety Programme, and really looking at how we can best generate evidence for digital technologies as to how they support the digital safety agenda. If I could have the final slide on this, please. And this sets out the work that we're doing against each of our commitments. The critical thing for us is really ensuring that we are clear on what we need to learn. So we really want to ensure that with yourselves as key stakeholders, that as we move into the discovery phase of the strategy implementation work, that we are really learning the things that we need to make this the best program that it can be. So really looking at how do we create a learning system and feedback loop, so it's not just about incident escalation, it's really taking those critical learnings and helping us A, get access to them, and B, look at how we take it forward. Training, as I've said previously, is really critical, so identifying who needs what training in the system, how do we sustain the trainer model, and how do we really support newer CSOs to ensure that they feel that they have the competence as they start to undertake those duties. How do we create a centralized source of digital clinical safety information? So it's really understanding what you need as stakeholders, and how can we also leverage the information that is there so that we're not recreating the wheel if there are really good resources that are already in play. How do we have end-to-end traceability so that the system yields the most benefits from safety? How do we look at that particularly with implants? And then finally, how do we support that evidence generation of applying that to the best of digital patient safety challenges? How do we really look at what evidence already exists in this space and how it can be used to scale digital safety interventions? So that's hopefully sort of a whistle-stop tour of the clinical safety strategy as is. And really keen on behalf of Kelsey to emphasise the sort of ask for further engagement to ensure that the strategy is exactly where it can be, where we want it to go as it continues to evolve. So if I could get the next slide, please. So sort of moving on to the DTAC section. So I really wanted to give sort of the context of really where DTAC came from, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we're using it without going into lots of practical implementation, but give you that sort of overview of the 5 key areas and the 5 things that we're looking for. So where DTAC really sort of evolved from is a bit of a potted history. So a couple of years ago, NHS Digital had developed an NHS apps library, and that was open to apps that had any sort of link to the long-term plan. And with that came an assessment criteria, which was called the DTAC. And what that was about a sort of, when you printed it, a 60 to 80 page document, which was really comprehensive in terms of the onboarding criteria for those apps onto nhs.uk. What we heard from those projects that wanted to get onto nhs.uk was it was taking them about 12 months, and it was a really iterative backwards and forwards process, largely actually reflecting potentially some of the digital immaturity in the processes of the digital health technologies and apps, particularly in the advice and guidance space, that hadn't necessarily engaged clinicians. They'd syndicated content, but fundamentally apps were failing that process. When NHSX was created, one of the first things that we did was a big piece on listening to innovators. And what they really told us was they wanted something like the DTAC that applied to digital health technologies, and it enabled them to be commissioned in the NHS. Sadly, we haven't been able to resolve commissioning and reimbursement yet, but I can touch on that a little bit later. But what we really thought about was, how do we take the DTAC and actually expand that? And what does that mean for the future of how we surface apps on nhs.uk? There was a sort of a document that was produced, which was called the NHS Standards. And what that set out was a kind of across 10 key areas, what we thought the standards should be. This has now been published by the NHSX AI Lab, and that's a guide to good practice for digital health technologies. So we did, just as COVID wave 1 hit, we launched a consultation, which we kept open, and said, we sort of, let's really extend this and really get feedback, because we thought we'd got the standards piece right. What innovators really told us was that actually, whilst having a set of standards was helpful, what it didn't say was, how will I be assessed? What do I actually really need to do tangibly? So you point me to lots of guidance, but what will I actually be asked, and what evidence will I need to present to an NHS organisation? So we took a big step back and said, actually, what we're trying to do here is help two cohorts. One, absolutely, it's really important that we support innovators, but ultimately we also want a product that supports the NHS and social care, where they were telling us as a sort of separate cohort that actually some organisations were struggling to really understand digital health technologies and what good practice in buying of DHTs meant. What should that due diligence process look like? What should they check? So we had two kind of opposite groups of stakeholders telling us absolutely the same thing. So we looked at the DTAC, we looked internationally, we spoke with a number of SMEs, and we came up with what is DTAC, and that focuses on 5 key areas. The first 4 are pass or fail. So really importantly, clinical safety. That's number 1. We see it as fundamentally the message that we should be sending to digital health technologies and buyers. Actually, it's the first section that's assessed, because if a product is not clinically safe, we absolutely shouldn't be adopting it in the NHS and using it on patients. So we put that up there front and centre. Data protection is the next section. So absolutely ensuring that products treat the data as citizens as they would expect, that it's really clear and that they're GDPR compliant, have the DSPT, etc. We then have technical assurance, so it's saying, does the product meet cyber essentials? Have they done a penetration test? Do we have that level of assurance that the National Cybersecurity Agency advocate for products that are being used in the NHS? We then have the interoperability section. So NHS Digital and NHSX have been doing a huge amount of work around interoperability standards, and we see that absolutely DTAC will evolve over time. So currently it's fairly light in terms of interop and a little bit open, so that buyers can really say this is exactly what we want, but we absolutely advocate for that avoidance of cost duplication. So we absolutely want digital health technologies, apps to push data into clinical systems. We really want to ensure that we get the best data in the right format to data standards, into EHRs and into the hands of clinicians where that's really valuable. So absolutely advocate for that. And then we developed, based on the NHS service standard, a scored section around usability and accessibility. And that really looks at, have apps and digital health technologies put user need? Have they done that service mapping work? Have they worked in multidisciplinary teams? And we've sort of ranked those because some of them within the service standard we sort of deem to be a nice to do. So if someone says they haven't worked in an agile way, that has a really low weighting, because ultimately there are other ways to develop technologies, but something like WCAG 2.1 compliance is absolutely fundamental, so that has a far higher weighting within that ranking. So we really got to this sort of set of questions that we felt were quite sensible in October of last year, and we went out from October to February of this year and did a 4-month sort of market stakeholder engagement with innovators, industry, NHS buyers, commissioners, and we had over 1,000 people engage with us, and we fundamentally said, does DTAC as it stands, is it the right baseline? So it's trying to be a baseline. It's trying to pull together what exists. So we haven't created a new clinical safety standard. We've said, you know, we absolutely advocate for DCB 129. You know, we ensure that products are assessed against medical device regulations. So we're encouraging that determination is absolutely made by the right person, by the right CSO. So there were a couple of tweaks that we made, but fundamentally the feedback was that we had got to what felt like a relatively sensible baseline for technology. What it's not trying to do is evidence of effectiveness. So that sort of other side of the coin, which we've been working with NICE on extensively, looking at how do we create a pathway where products meet DTAC. There is more capacity within NICE to do that evidence of effectiveness piece. And that really then supports those really robust decisions being made about technology that can be then implemented in the NHS. So we, as I say, launched the sort of first version. We continue to keep it under review, and I would see that we will have a sort of slightly tweaked version in the new year, as there are some suggested changes from SMEs coming through. But we've been really clear across NHSX that we should sort of join up as much as possible and continue to link to each other's work. So DTAC is absolutely referenced in the digital clinical safety strategy. It's assessed in what good looks like, and we're also looking at how we mandate it as well through an information standard next year. So that's sort of where I was going to pause on DTAC and the safety strategy.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll let you catch your breath. Thank you very much for that. There are quite a few questions that have been coming in that I know Maggie has been looking at, but just one which I kind of noted was if I could just start some of the questions off and to maybe ask specifics to you. But thanks very much for the presentation. And we may just bring up some of the chat as we go along, but it was a question around the medical devices and how DTAC takes into account medical devices and the medical device regulations. Do you have a separate section for that, DTAC, Lauren?
So it's under the clinical safety section. So it involves a validation of the medical device classification that the product has stated they are. So I guess, so what we have done is worked with the MHRA and ensuring that they're comfortable with the wording in DTAC, that it's seen as a validation, as obviously they're the regulators. So there's guidance in the document to say that actually if a CSO thinks that a product is a 2A, for example, and it has nothing, we would absolutely point them to the MHRA. We also have a link there into Johan and his team, who are very supportive of DTAC. So if anything sort of rings alarm bells, we can also feed that into the MHRA, but it's very much they want to collaborate rather than be a stick. So if something, you know, if we do discover something, they want to work with those products to ensure that they do have the correct classification, unless it's fundamentally going to kill someone. And we've also done quite an extensive review with the MHRA around what notified bodies assess. So there is nothing in DTAC currently. I know obviously medical device regs around cybersecurity are open to consultation. The consultation's just ended, but we're not duplicating anything for products that are a 2A in DTAC that they would have been gone through and assessed with their notified body. So we've looked at whether there were any opportunities of passportability around that, but we're sort of quite joined up, and it's, I think, a positive thing to be able to say to the market and also those that are using their resource to assess technologies that they're not duplicating on regulated products.
Yeah, okay. But there are some supplementary questions coming in on the chat about how do you know, do you cross-check the registration number, all the things that sometimes we had in the DAC, you know, the problems of cross-checking. So what's your extent of verification of the information that's put down?
Yes, so we absolutely say cross-check the registration number and the certificate number. We also have said previously to the system, if anyone is struggling, I know sometimes there have been things that haven't been able to be located, we can absolutely validate and support in validating with the MHRA in that respect.
Okay, fine. Okay, thanks, Laura. Maggie, I'm going to bring you in now for
Yep.
a little question coordination, but the medical device thing I think we've covered off.
Yes, that's fine. And the medical devices raise their heads in almost every discussion we have, because there is some complexity around that. So, and I'm aware that Lauren is working at that level with the agency, and some of us who are doing jobbing CSO things need to understand that a bit better, and that's something we need to progress outside of this meeting. Well done, Lauren, for doing 2 presentations and making them so clear, because that was quite hard work. So I've got a couple of questions here, which is about, Jenny asked whether all NHS frameworks are using DTAC, and Jeremy asked whether Orca is using DTAC. So I think those are general things about how whether these sort of these bodies or these commission bodies are actually applying the standards that you like them to.
Yeah, so we're working with the HSSF team, so the Health Services Framework. They are in train in updating their onboarding question sets to include DTAC. We worked on the GP secondary care provider framework earlier this year. So DTAC was a prerequisite of that and one of the GP locum software ones. I think moving forward, as it becomes an information standard, it makes it easier to sort of mandate it across that, but we're certainly looking to ensure that this is aligned, rather than something that we're asking the system to do, something we're doing, and then there's some sort of outlier frameworks that don't do it. So absolutely trying to...
So sorry, Lauren, sorry, you broke up and I thought you'd stopped. I'm so sorry. What I suppose what we're saying at the moment, not all frameworks are DTAC compliant, so possibly people who are looking to get things off the frameworks may want to do their own DTAC assessment to them at the moment. Yeah, which is good practice anyway, because I will say to people, just because something's on a framework, so we know that that's 0129 largely, you'll still have to do your 0160, so you probably have to look at it anyway. Another question about, somebody asked, and I'm sorry I didn't write your name down, and I wrote it, about development versus if you're doing development and deployment, which so what I call co-production, so you're managing 0129, 0160, how does DTAC apply to that? I don't know. I just wonder if Damian's going to be discussing that in his slides or demonstrating it, and or Lauren, do you want to give your reply?
Yep. So I didn't answer the question on Orca, so I'll do that one.
Yeah.
But so we Orca have an Orca baseline review. Yep. That does not cover all the aspects of DTAC, so I think it covers about 60%, but it doesn't do an in-depth clinical safety review. So it looks at slightly different things. It's more automated. What they are now offering is a DTAC assessment. So we know that they've put a number of products through DTAC, and that they recognise that it is now the NHS standard. So they will offer kind of either or. They can also apply filters on these apps that have been through DTAC if localities have bought an Orca apps library, which is something that we'd absolutely advocate for, to ensure that we're surfacing those products through apps libraries that have been validated to the NHS standard. And in terms of where organisations are both, I can kind of give a quick answer and then hand over to Damian. So I think we have seen that with certification. So we've been kind of both. We've absolutely held ourselves to the DTAC standard. So we've kind of, I guess, had the dev teams factoring that into their build. And then we've also done that as part of our assurance process. So we've also said, actually, we are deploying. We've done a clinical safety case. We've reflected in the clinical safety case the role, our kind of dual role, but we've set out actually what our clinical risk management framework is, how we operate to that. And then we've also ensured that through our kind of no-go release calls and due diligence, that where we need penetration tests, etc., that the dev team have absolutely put the pen test in, we've then reviewed it, and that we've used that DTAC assurance as part of our deployment no-go calls to actually say that we're content that for each release we have fulfilled the requirements amongst other release management activities, but we've embedded that within the release management program.
So Damian, is that something you've come across? Are you building stuff in Birmingham and Solihull, or are you just doing the sort of the 0160 approach?
Mainly the 0160 approach.
Okay, so that is something that we have to build in, and I think again that's a discussion for within the SIG about how you do that, what I would call co-production or unified production. So, I'm something that Chris Dixon and other people are supporting as well, planning to share clinical safety information about the product. We're getting quite detailed now, but I absolutely concur with this, because in my day job I do clinical safety consultancy across a wide variety of deployments, and it's very useful to sort of take the lessons learned from one area to another. You can't just lift and shift, but the questions that you need to ask will still be the same. So there is that bit about showing, and again, this is Lauren, you're not expected to answer this question, but I think it's a very important one, is how do we build up this useful learning and share it properly. I think some people are quite inhibited by non-disclosure agreements with providers to say, if you discover something, don't tell anybody. So there is that piece there. I would also acknowledge, Chris, because this is a passion of Chris and myself, is why is usability separate from clinical safety, because it's all the same thing, isn't it? Chris, speaking for myself, I like the fact that there is somebody else doing a usability thing with some criteria, but I agree it's part of clinical safety. So Lauren, should we go back to that piece about sharing the information we gather and how we share the safety about how we use the product with each other?
Sorry, Maggie. Yeah, so I think that's one of the real challenges that we still have, is because of confidentiality agreements, etc. How do we actually, and it really links into the work that Kelsey, James and Natasha were doing, how do we set up this infrastructure? We currently have the MHRA process, but it's not been hugely well established, I don't think, within digital. That actually, if there is an incident that we go to the MHRA and that we then look at how that's subsequently shared outwards. So the sort of MHRA communication powers changed earlier this year. So previously they were limited in what information they could push out publicly in that space. They are now actually able to be more vocal, although we haven't yet seen it happen in terms of sort of coming out with things. So I think this is really sort of DTAC and broader. How do we set up that sort of community and infrastructure to share hazards or incidents that are related to DHTs? So I think there's something about DTAC as an input, but fundamentally, for example, if a CSO in a trust was assessing a product X, and that should be a 2A, but it has no medical device classification, and actually we know that that product's being used quite widely, I think it's really answering whose responsibility is that, and how do we set up something so that it doesn't create undue liability on individual organisations, but how do we support that knowledge sharing that we would have in medicines, for example, which we don't have as well embedded in DHTs. So
just to clarify that, so because I'm keeping an eye on the chat and trying to sort of work out what you're saying and work out where it's answering question. So I think that you're saying there is already an opportunity to share incidents and some of the high level stuff. I think what other people are looking for is what we've learned in the deployment of use and how you prevent incidents, and how you say you need to look out for this when you're deploying, otherwise you will have an incident. So there's that piece there that I think is probably on the scope of this very short session, but I think it's worth highlighting again, and I think it's something that clinical safety officers are looking for a lot. One more thing is Barbara Arroyo was looking for some policies. Again, I think that will probably come out of this session. I think we certainly need to be looking at that again, and we're thinking about that, Barbara. And it may be that after Damian's presentation you have some better ideas about it. I'm just going to go back because Dave, do you mind, David, if I quote you verbatim? How sustainable is all this lot? Don't get me wrong, completely support the principles encouraging end user ownership of systems and understanding their needs. But if your organisation has 18,000 clinical devices and 20,000 other digital health systems, how does a clinical safety office do their day job? Lots of stuff in there, David, and that's about sort of health, the resources and prioritisation and things. But on the other hand, Lauren, I think what people are looking for is probably some guidance on how to manage that, and possibly some standards around what we do with existing devices, how much resources needed for these things within trusts. May not be in your gift, but I think that probably is. Does that sort of sum it up, David? If you're happy to speak, David Willis.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive on. So
go on.
so I'm the acting senior information security officer for an ICS. So I'm looking at how we deploy this stuff across a health economy rather than just onto an acute trust. Particularly interested in how we get GPs engaged in this stuff. I completely categorically agree we have to take this from a clinical safety perspective. But the reality on the ground is at the moment, to be a clinical safety officer, you've got to be a clinician. I don't object to that in any way. But we're putting a lot of work on people. So take it from the perspective of an acute. If you're implementing a rheumatology system, can you expect somebody who works in A&E to sort of certify it as being clinically safe? I mean, I've seen, so one of our local acute hospitals has put sort of a kind of outline structure together on how this would work. And honestly, to me, it looks like you've created an empire of people to do the job. There's two ways to build a pyramid. One is to use lots of people, which is what we seem to be doing. The other is to get some technologies in, get some JCBs. We still need some people to run the JCBs, but we can still build the pyramid. Now, I know that the acutes in my area, 3 of the 4, have started deploying technical solutions, which will tell them about particularly medical devices and the safety of medical devices. And at this point, we're only really interested in connected medical devices. If this is a standalone piece of kit, it's never going to be connected to a computer network. Things aren't going to change other than the fact that the kit will wear. And that gets picked up on an annual basis as part of testing by the medical equipment department. Whereas if you're connecting it to a computer network, it's a different level of risk. It's a completely different ball game. It could have been absolutely safe mechanically and absolutely safe according to DTAC yesterday. Today it isn't, because this has happened. And without having technologies to help us with that, and without having technologies to help us, and without looking at that huge, bigger picture, all we seem to be doing is throwing people at the problem. And people alone can't deal with it when it's sat on a network.
Yeah, David, I think good point. I think if I can just let Lauren respond to that, because I think it's probably a comment shared by many organisations, and something I'm sure NHSX Digital are thinking of how to manage this volume.
Yeah, so we're certainly looking, so working with Sonia Patel's team around in the establishment of ICSs, what is actually needed in terms of governance in some of these areas. So my team is certainly contributing to that. I think if we take this from if we kind of look at this from a risk-based perspective, what we saw during COVID were lots of remote monitoring technologies that were deployed very quickly that were actually fundamental in care homes. And that included kit, but fundamentally included platforms. And actually what we saw was no one had actually looked at those technologies to see what level of clinical risk there was. Were they really risk stratifying patients? We just had kind of kit going in, GPs then saying, I really don't want this data. And people not understanding the technologies that they were deploying and the level of clinical risk for patients. That, maybe an extreme example during COVID, but what we see are lots of digital health technologies, so lots of apps and lots of systems where we're getting people to input data, and they're being used to make decision making about patient care, and fundamentally they haven't been assessed in any way by a clinician. They've just been bought or piloted or recommended by someone. And actually we did a really big piece of work around who's actually buying digital health technologies and what are they actually looking at. And fundamentally the system came to us and said, we really don't, we know we should be doing something, but we really don't know what we should be doing. So we've tried to set out, I guess, as a minimum what we think organizations actually should start to look at when buying a digital health technology. And DTAC is fundamentally not exhaustive because it's not actually looking at the efficacy and clinical effectiveness of a product, which is a whole sort of other assessment when making a decision. It completely doesn't answer your question, David, in terms of how do we resource this. What we're saying to organizations is you really do need to start thinking about this, because as we adopt more and more DHTs, we wouldn't not do due diligence on a medicine, or we wouldn't not do due diligence on really other similar products. Digital health technology seem to have sort of evolved as a thing, and it does, when you kind of say what did you look at in actually buying that technology or piloting it, it may actually have fundamentally been nothing. So if there is patient harm, we still leave ourselves exposed, and that's I guess we're advocating for DTAC on the basis that organizations need to assess the level of risk that they're prepared to take. If actually there is patient harm and we haven't done anything when rolling out a digital health technology, we've just let it loose on patients. So we've taken kind of a national position and said this is absolutely what we think it should be, but ultimately currently decision making is local, and if that due diligence isn't done, then that is currently is sort of where the risk sits.
Okay.
Lauren, thank you. Sorry. So I think what you're saying is that the I've taken about that and David's concerns is that clinical safety needs to move out of the assurance level. It needs to be owned by an accountable people. In an ICS, you need accountability, and that hasn't often been clear in LICAs and STPs, whatever else you want to call them. So there is a need, and I think what people will be looking for is some national guidance around that, so that we don't just do clinical safety reports and put them into the ether. Also, I think going back to the other piece about resources, this is my analogy always is about hygiene and infection control. Everybody knows how to wash their hands and why. The infection control nurse does not wash their hands for them. So we need to develop another layer of everybody understanding what clinical safety is and how they can contribute to this discussion. And that's my personal where I want to progress, is getting everybody sort of competent and fluent in clinical safety as it affects them in their job. So I'll stop now. I promise I wouldn't speak, but I couldn't stop myself.
I have one. We're going to have one more question, and we're going to move on to Damian. But I just from Mike Anderson, if I could just read this out. This is for Lauren, really. Are there plans to iterate the DTAC in the near future? As currently a submission for a particular health product which falls in scope of the DCBs, but out of scope of medical device status, the DTAC suggests that a conformity certificate is required. Under the DCB standards, such certification is not defined and is purely related to medical devices, and this is causing some confusion. So it's about iteration of the DTAC in the near future. How do we iterate this better?
So I know, Mike, you've raised that before. That's not what it's trying to say, and we haven't actually seen that through any of the submissions that have gone into that kind of Maggie's team have assessed, or some that we've looked at. So I think that may be a few isolated people. So it's on the sort of list of changes, but we're trying to do a consolidated version. There's a couple of tweaks from the MHRA just around signposting to evidence that could be reused from their notified body assessment. So where some products that are 2As think they don't have a hazard log, it's just around language, so a little bit more signposting. But that is certainly on the list, Mike. But I don't think from the kind of feedback that we're getting, it's causing a huge amount of confusion. So we haven't issued a new version just for that in isolation.
Okay, right. Okay, well, thanks very much, Lauren. And we're going to keep the chat flowing with questions being posted. Maggie, thanks for coordinating that bit as well. Difficult to kind of read questions and listen to answers, I know, but thanks very much. We're going to move on, if we could, to the second presentation, because I'm aware of time again. And Damian, I'd like to welcome Damian Williams, who I'm going to, Dr. Damian, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, if you could, and then we're going to hand over to you for about 20 minutes just for second presentation, then a further batch of questions which may start to bring together some of the general comments that you're thinking about. So, Damian, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Can I just check you can see my screen, my slides?
Yes,
you can. Okay. I can just see all of your videos, so I was just checking that that I'd done it right. So thank you very much. My name's Damian. I'm a GP in Birmingham, and I'm one of 2 clinical safety officers at Birmingham and Solihull CCG. And so what I'm hoping to sort of look at today is how we've done this locally. So I'm not going to talk much at all about the details of the process, but more about what it's meant to us locally, why we're doing it, and so on. And before I do, some of you may have seen, I was supposed to be co-presenting this with Kate Thomas, and unfortunately she's not able to join us, but she's been vital in our local process and also helped with the slides, so I can't not give her credit for that. And it also brings out another important point, which is already coming up in the chat, which is that this sort of work does require a lot of resource and dedicated resource to do it well. So briefly, what I'm hoping to cover is where this came from for us in terms of our local assurance framework, a little bit about how it works, and then also some lessons learned, and hopefully you'll find that that useful. So this all started with our vision statement, which has absolutely nothing to do with clinical safety or assurance. We started because we wanted to enable our practices to be able to have their own IT budget and to be able to choose what systems they were using, particularly focusing on some of the online consultation, video consultation stuff, but actually it goes kind of wider than that. And one of the reasons for doing this is that if practices are choosing the products that they use, they are far more likely to use them. And that's when you start getting the real value and benefit from these products. One of the things we looked at when we looked at our estate, we realized that there were products that practices had and they weren't using them. We were paying for them, but they weren't using them. We can't afford to do that. And so this was part of our kind of reason for doing this. However, having realized we were going to hand this responsibility over to practices, we also realized that actually we need to help those practices in choosing those products. What we didn't want was a whole range of all sorts of weird and wonderful that actually didn't allow us to meet our obligations in terms of information governance, clinical safety, cybersecurity, etc. So we realized that there was actually another step to giving practices choice, and that was enabling them to make good choices. And so that's where our local assurance framework came from. And so we actually started this process before DTAC came out. So we don't actually do DTAC, we do our own local framework. But before the DTAC team have a complete fit, we are actually remarkably close to each other. And hopefully you can see the colours. Apologies to anyone who's colourblind. But actually, most of what we do matches up with what DTAC does. And that's, of course, not surprising because we're aiming for the same thing. I would point out a couple of differences, though, and that is we've got a route to market and service level agreements and onboarding and offboarding, which is, there are bits of that in DTAC, but not a lot. And this is our localization, because whereas DTAC primarily is about assurance, we're looking at not only assurance but implementation. And so that was the first bit of kind of localization for us, in order to sort of make this practical. So it is not just a theoretical tick box exercise, but actually something that we can use in our local implementations. So this is our framework. Don't worry about any of the detail. But we've got a whole series of sections and assessments that we ask our suppliers to complete. And in time, we're going to look to sort of bring this in line with DTAC, because actually a lot of the questions we ask are much the same. And this is a completed one. You really can't see the detail in this one, but what you can see is that there's a section where the supplier has done their submission, and then a series of reviews. For this supplier, as you can see, our first review wasn't particularly positive, and they failed just about everything. But through a process of second, third, fourth, and eventually a fourth review, we've actually got to the point where they had passed everything. And this particular supplier was a new supplier to the market. They didn't have a lot of experience in these areas. And so actually by working through this process, we were able to come to a point where their product was better and we were far more assured. So actually, this was a very positive interaction, not a negative one, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So when we come to the end of that process, however long it takes, some of them are quite quick, some are a lot longer, we end up with a sign-off report. So it's not just the filling in of the actual form, we produce then something that kind of is usable, and that has all the dates and names of the people involved, so that it's a sort of transparent process, and actually a process where people can come back and question us on what we've done. And in terms of the report then, this current one is 16 pages long. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to take you through all 16 pages, but it contains a summary of all the different things that we've done as part of the assessment process, so that someone who was implementing it would have all the information they need. And I just wanted to highlight two other things that we have. One is a section about action for practices. So like I say, we're very much looking at implementation at a practice level, and the practices have some responsibility in that, and we make that sort of clear to them. But as part of the report, we've provided them with most of the answers they need to be able to do that process. So we're supporting the practices to do what they need to be doing. The other thing that we have is feedback from practices who are already using the product. So obviously this doesn't apply when you first select a product, but we keep it up to date so that when a practice is choosing a system, they can actually see, well, what do other users find with this system? Because one of the things we found was that practices were taking systems and then very quickly afterwards were changing to something else because it didn't meet their needs. And we hope that this process will help practices to sort of make better choices. So, like I say, a lot of this for us was about supporting practices, both in choosing products, in ensuring that the products were safe and well implemented, but also in having this virtual budget. So we've got the SharePoint site that looks at the finance side, so they know what they can spend and what they're spending it on, as well as the functionality that comes with it. But then also looking at their usage. So are they actually using the products that they're paying for? That goes to a fair level of detail if needed. So and we have a support pack to go with all of it to help practices to know what all of this means, because we realise that our practices aren't all experts at clinical safety or cybersecurity, and we need to support them in doing that. And the other thing we have is a catalogue. So these are the products who've been through our sort of assurance process and that the practices can choose from. So this is where it becomes more kind of practical on the ground. There's an overview of some of the products and how much they cost and what functions they have. And as you can see, this is quite focused on online consultation, video consultation. And every product has its own section where there's a summary of the functionality that it has, as well as a summary of the findings of our assurance process. So practices can very quickly look at a summary and then dive into the detail afterwards if as they want to. I've gone through that fairly quickly. I hope not too quickly, and certainly there's time for questions. But one of the reasons for going through it quickly is so that I've still got a bit of time, which I think I have, to tell you about some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. And the first lesson is about resource. This does take resource, and obviously we've had a few questions about that already. We've now got 2 project managers who work on this, as well as a range of, sort of subject matter experts, clinical safety officers, IG, cybersecurity, etc., who do this kind of these assessments. And I think we as a CCG we really believe in it. We believe that clinical safety, cybersecurity, information governance are important, and therefore, even though it does take a lot of resource, and when I see all the clinical safety reviews in my diary, I'm not always massively impressed by the amount of time it's going to take up. But actually, that's what's kind of really important. And as I put in the chat, sort of earlier, dealing with an incident that happens because you haven't implemented something properly takes an awful lot more time than doing these reviews. So we really believe that it's worth it, but it takes resource. The other thing then is that each of the areas overlap. So someone mentioned about, well, why have you got usability separate? Because the same also applies for, kind of IG, cybersecurity, clinical safety. They all overlap with each other. So for us, we do this, even though the separate groups will do their thing. So, we've got a clinical safety group and a IG group. We actually all talk to each other all the time, because things that become apparent in the clinical safety will have an effect on IG and cybersecurity, and they see things that raises questions for them in clinical safety. So actually we have, in our spreadsheet, we pass notes back and forth to each other all the time. And so I would certainly encourage anyone doing this to not separate out those areas too much. Actually that all of the groups need to be working together to come to, the final, sort of conclusion. I may not need to say this in this group, hopefully I don't, but, kind of clinicians are an important part of the process. And like I say, I hopefully don't need to say it to this group, but I certainly see in other areas where clinicians aren't involved in these processes. And, I think that generally is a bad idea. And it's not just clinicians, it's anyone who's actually using it for real and who understands what the real life situation is that this product is going to be in. These products cannot be assessed in isolation, because it only becomes real when you actually start using it. So that's just a personal passion of mine. The other thing we've done is say that we now don't review any of our products until we've had a product demonstration, which does take a bit of time, but actually is, kind of, we find is essential, because if you don't understand what the product does, you can't know what the clinical safety risks should be. And I noticed someone in the chat asked a question about, kind of the quality of clinical safety cases, for example, from one supplier to another. That certainly fits with our experience. We don't take the clinical safety case or the hazard report entirely at face value. We look through it to see, does it contain the things we expect to see? And of course, knowing what the product is and does enables us to then do that. So you have to understand the product. Somebody else asked about, what happens if an A&E doctor, kind of is the CSO, but they're asked to assess radiology. And I think, someone else answered, well, if you're a CSO, you should be able to do it. And in lots of ways, I would agree with that, because the principles apply, but actually you do still need to know roughly what the product does and how it does it. Otherwise, you can't do it. So we weren't sure when we started this what sort of response we were going to get from the suppliers. And I'm glad to say the vast majority have been very happy to engage with us on this. It was new. They hadn't really done anything like this before, for a lot of them. But actually, most of them were very happy to be part of it, found it beneficial, and like I say, in some cases, it highlighted things that they had either not realised or perhaps had slipped. And we all know how easy it is for something that you have to have every year to miss the deadline, and pick things up. That's fine. And it's about a collaborative sort of approach. But not everybody was totally on board with this. We did get some sort of pushback from some, and probably one of the most common pushbacks we had was, well, we're on the framework, so you don't have to ask us any of this. The point we made to them was, well, we're the commissioners, so we're the ones who are responsible for implementing this product. Yes, it might have passed all the assurance to be on the framework, but we're assessing whether it's suitable for us in our environment with all of the factors that we know locally. So, yes, we do need to see these things. And, if you're already on the framework, it should be very easy for you to produce them for us. So we didn't accept that as an excuse. We also had we can't share it with you because this is commercially sensitive. We didn't take that one either. These things either are already should be in the public domain, like, kind of privacy notices, or if we are an NHS organisation considering purchasing these products, or maybe already using them, then we have a right to see them. So we took no prisoners, and actually, in the end, people were happy to share with us. And I think one of the reasons for this is that some of the suppliers saw this as a pass-fail. And I know, of course, we talk about pass and fail, and Lauren had pass and fail on her slides. And of course, there has to be a judgment made. But actually, a lot of this isn't a black and white pass and fail. We're not out to, kind of punish or target suppliers who aren't good enough. What we really want is to work with these suppliers to ensure that the products we have are as safe as they can be, and we understand the risks, and therefore, sort of can bring all that, sort of together in the safest possible way. So this is a collaboration with suppliers. It's not an examination just an examination they have to pass. So of course, there are things that they have to do. So I can see Sebastian looking worried because I'm talking too much. You'll be glad to know this is my last point. And the last point is that there's always much more to learn. We've been on a long journey. We've made mistakes. We've learned from them, hopefully, but we still have a lot more to learn. We hope that the process will continue to improve. Hopefully that is my last slide. Yep, there we are.
Yeah, thanks. Damian, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. It takes some general. I've got a lot of echo in my end, I think, but it should be okay now. Just thank you, Damian, for that. And I just really sensible. I was just thinking, I'm in general practice as well, as you know, and in the early days, and even recently, how many demos do we actually have? How many systems do we actually look at in this systematic way? So I think there's something really important about bringing, the theory of DTAC into the practicalities of the working spaces you've done in Birmingham and Solihull. And I was going to ask whether is this something which is throughout just one CCG, Birmingham and Solihull CCG, or others as well? Have you managed to bring it or disseminate it wider?
Yeah, so we very much started as our CCG, but have also not been at all shy in telling people what we're doing. And actually, we've got several other CCGs who have come to us and said, we really like what you're doing. We know we need to be doing it, but we're not quite sure how. Can you help us? And so we've, kind of shared a lot of our learning with other CCGs. We've done assessments for other CCGs to try and help them to, kind of do it together, as it were. In order to share that learning, because it's not ours. It has to be for the benefit ultimately of the patient.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, we're going to have some general questions on both presentations, but kind of focusing probably on Damian's more. So Maggie, on. So
Damian, one point that was fabulous. Thank you. And can I just say there were various claps in there that I didn't catch necessarily who sent them, but very much there was I noticed a clap for pushing back against suppliers who wouldn't play ball, and so I wish I got there first. The other thing I'm going to say is in regards to your having that clinical expertise or that user expertise, and I think always ask receptionists because they tell you what really happens in the right context, but also if a product is patient facing, do you have patients who tell you what it's like to be a patient deciding how do I request more prescriptions, how do I send a message? Have you got a patient user group? This isn't an exam question, this is just me asking.
No, a very good question. No, we haven't particularly involved patients in our assessments. I suppose partly maybe because we just haven't thought about it, but partly because I suppose a lot of that is about the usability of it,
yes,
perhaps rather than the safety and security of it. Though, as somebody has already said, usability is important.
Clinical safety, yeah.
As well.
Because I mean, in the end, if you can't remember how it is you're supposed to log into your practice to request your repeat medications, for example, and that's a little bit sort of niche, but it's not so much is a product usable, do they know which one to use and when and how, so the patient experience rather than, and it doesn't have to be a patient, it has to be somebody thinking on their behalf. So basically, so the theme of it was, can you share this? Can you share these slides? Can you share what you do? That was a big thing. So I'll leave that to you. There was Jeremy Wilkinson was talking about the problems with ownership of risk in ICSs, and I think we've been, Jeremy, I share your pain, and I think that I've got to the point now, if I don't know who I'm writing the clinical safety case for, and then I'm not going to do it because I need to be able to hand that risk over to people. ICSs still don't have that legal entity piece, do they? But if a group of health and care organisations have some joint needs, they have to have some joint memorandum of understanding and share out that accountability. And it's disingenuous for people to shove it all down on assurance. Assurance is not an island. Lastly, how much time do you think this takes, Damian, for the I mean, I know possibly how often do you touch it in the process, but how long do people have to spend on each element to get from your first review to your final review?
Yes, not easy. It does vary a lot. Not an easy question to answer. I mean, we tend to have 1 hour sessions when we do these things. So as you saw, that supplier, sort of before, with the started off very red, ended up very green. Kind of our first session probably took more than an hour, but then subsequent sessions took less. But obviously, we generally have in clinical safety and information governance and cybersecurity, kind of all doing reviews. So everyone may have spent, kind of 2 or maybe 3 hours on each of those areas.
Yeah.
And then there's all the chasing that the project managers and things have to do with the suppliers, because, kind of, if we ask questions, they go back to them, they've got to wait for them to reply, and someone's got to keep track of it all.
So you do, so that bit about resource, you do need somebody to keep somebody competent to manage all the toings and froings.
Yeah. You saw my picture of Kate at the beginning. Kate is our person who does that, and she's fantastic, and she keeps track of everything. And that's vital, really. And I think there is a resource issue here. I'm very glad that our CCG is very supportive, and we have some dedicated time to do this. My colleagues in our region who are in acute trusts, I'm not sure they get given the time that they need for that. And they've got to do their day job and somehow squeeze this in at other times.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be addressed.
Do you find, and then there's a whole lot of questions going on, do you find though that having that initial thing where they demo it reduces the amount of time spent your SMEs thereafter? Do you feel that's a really good investment of time? And that informs the process downstream. Definitely. Okay, thank you.
We say to them, look, we want a demo. We do not want a sales pitch.
Yeah.
And on the team will be experts in clinical safety, information governance, and cybersecurity. So you need to make sure you've got those experts on your end of the call as well, because we will ask some very detailed questions. So that any of the suppliers who are sensible get their, kind of relevant people onto the call as well. And actually, we can often bottom out a lot of issues. And if we come against something in one of our reviews, we'll often just set up a call with the supplier, because it's easier sometimes just to talk an issue through than.
Absolutely, because otherwise it becomes a tennis match rather than a discussion and collaboration.
Exactly.
There are lots of stuff. There's lots of stuff coming through. I think somebody's talking about data dashboards. So Charles is asking about. Sorry, I'm going to go through this methodically. Charles is asking, you used to understand what guidance from the CCG for the individual GP practices. Would there be an expectation that practices would be required to produce their own clinical safety case reports?
That's a very difficult question. I'm not sure I want to fully answer it. I think what we hope is that effectively we are doing the heavy lifting of a DCB 0160. That we then pass on to the practices. We specifically ask the suppliers, what do you do to help practices with their 0160? And they're often quite surprised at that question. And a few of them have come back and said, that's not our job. But most of them actually say, oh, well, we've got this and we've got that. And what we look to do is to have a sort of a standardized implementation approach, so that provided the practice implement it in the way that it was intended and that we assessed, they can essentially just take what we've done, you know, look to see if there are any local issues, but actually the job is done. So we're trying to take the burden off the practice, but the reality is it's only the practice knows how their local systems work, and therefore how the product will work in there. So there has to be some work for the practice if they want to do it, you know, kind of right.
So the thing about data dashboards, and if you don't mind, Stephen and Barbara, I think that the data dashboard things is something that comes up, and again, I think the team at the SIG need to think about that thing about data dashboards, if you don't mind about that, just so we can get through some of the other questions. Also, somebody's asking, does your CSO use consider a test patient to try and break a system ever? Do you use?
Oh, we do.
Yeah. Okay. Fabulous.
We enjoy doing that.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
We can't,
okay.
we can't always, but often.
Yeah.
It's really valuable to do that.
So not just a demo, but a sandpit to sort of to go and say how it was. Fabulous. Heidi from Salisbury. How sustainable is it to have multiple organisation clinicians conducting exactly the same task on a national level? Will there be a platform or publication area which all parties can contribute? I think, Lauren, does that sit with you? Or I mean, I know we're all trying to move to the same thing, but is what's the view from the bridge, sort of thing, on that one? So this is in the chat. This is Heidi Lynn.
Sorry, let me just.
That's okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, whilst Lynn reads the question, we certainly have been looking to share some of what we've been doing, because we don't want other CCGs and practices to have to repeat everything that we've done. Somebody asked a question in the chat earlier, you know, and sort of I replied, you know, if someone that you kind of trust has already done an assessment, then actually you can pick that up and greatly accelerate what you've done, you know, sort of what you need to do, because they've probably answered most, and you might have a few extra local things that you need to ask, but actually most of the work is done. So we're certainly looking at, you know, partnering with other CCGs to do that, but it would be great to have a more national, you know, sort of sharing, you know, sort of system.
So Lauren, we've got 5 minutes. So do you want to? You don't have to answer this.
No, and
then we let Sebastian round up.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've looked at is passportability, and actually, the two of the kind of challenges that we really see are around use case. So if you look at remote monitoring platforms, for example, we're seeing lots of them relying on functionality being turned off, and saying I'm a class 1, or I don't require a classification. Fundamentally, they have 2A functionality, but they're saying no, it's not turned on, so don't worry about it. Well, and also that we've kind of had a number of scenarios where we've seen different NHS organisations buy the same product, but with a really different data controller relationship, and data processing agreements being put in place. So where we then looked at them and said, actually, the NHS should absolutely have been the data controller. We see lots of people entering into shared controllership agreements. So as we stand at the minute, with those being kind of the two big upfront fundamental sections, we've said we will look at a way that information could be shared whilst respecting commercial confidentiality. Sorry, there's an ambulance going past. But we haven't yet been able to come up with a mechanism from a liability perspective where we're actually able to share this information. What we've also really cautioned against is organisations placing too much reliance on other organisations and not making that use case judgment, particularly in some of the more complex technologies where they're either potentially a borderline case, or we know that they're sort of relying on functionality being turned off, because you could then buy a product that you're using as a 2A, but fundamentally you've then used a kind of safety case and assurance on the classification of a different use case. So I think it's something we continue to look at, but we haven't managed to yet come up with a mechanism of kind of central sharing, but it'd be certainly something that we continue to look at.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Lauren. I'm just going to say there have been lots more questions, and Maggie, thanks for coordinating, because I've been scanning questions as well, but it's really a really useful meeting, I think. And Lauren, thanks so much for your talk and presentation, and on behalf of Kelsey as well. And Damian, fascinating. And I think it's something that, you know, this needs to be national almost, this process, doesn't it, of procurement of systems, and hopefully with the kind of with DTAC as well, that may well kind of facilitate it. It's interesting your process mirrored DTAC very, very closely. And I was just going to ask, I think, Damian, your system was designed before DTAC, wasn't it?
It was probably in parallel, but we didn't know it was happening. So yes, we did it independent of DTAC.
Yeah, but it's very interesting about this analysis. But I think it's been a really useful couple of sessions. There have been questions about requests to share slides. I will email both of you with thanks, and we normally do share PDF versions if that's okay, but you can cut down the presentations if necessary. If there's any sensitive CCG information in there, Damian, but I will email you about that. For our 86, I think we were up to 120 at one stage. All our participants, they were asking for copies of the presentation. So we will certainly find some slides that are not sensitive and we can be shared from Damian and from Lauren as well, I'm sure. But just to say, just to say really great thanks to Lauren and Damian again for presenting to the faculty SIG, Special Interest Group Safety, and the National CSO is really interesting. I'm going to try and finish right on time. So if there are any general comments about the meeting, do send them through to Jan, if that's okay, Jan. Any general questions, comments, follow-up questions, and this is an ongoing process, and so we try and hold these meetings every 3 months now. So we're having another meeting, and any ideas for future meetings, do let us know, myself, Maggie, or Clive. And I just wanted to say thanks also to Maggie and Clive for coordinating this as well. A lot of work's involved, and also thanks to the faculty again, to Jan, tireless work on Jan and her team, and Ben standing at short notice. But so I should say thanks very much again, folks, and speak to some of you again soon.
Please
And Maggie,
complete the evaluation. Please complete the evaluation. Ben has just posted it,
yes.
And that'd be really helpful, because that will help us decide what we do next.
Yeah, and any future ideas, really appreciate any future presentation
We've
topics.
got dashboards and medical devices on so far.
All right. Well, thanks very much, folks. I'm going to let you all go to have a good rest of the day and weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.